I have just read four Jeanette Winterson books, and today I am going to go through them and compare them. I'm going to have to be a little bit of a hater for these two books. Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit and Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal. But it's because I know what this author is capable of, and I really like some of her work, and I really don't like some of her work. So I'm going to start with Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. So this was her first book, and she wrote it when she was 25, and it was published in 1985. It's 224 pages long, and this copy also has like whole pages for the chapter titles, and then also little doodles in between the chapters. So it's a brief book. So, in the introduction, she clarifies that this is a novel and it's not necessarily autobiographical. But the main character is named Jeanette, and her upbringing is extremely similar to the author's upbringing in real life. So, I would call this autofiction, but that seems like almost combative because the author is so forceful in the introduction that this isn't autobiographical. It shouldn't be read that way. And she also makes a point that observations about how when women make art, we tend to automatically assume it's some kind of confessional or it has to be directly related to their lives, and then men don't get that same treatment, which I understand. I just think in this particular case, it is so similar to her upbringing, which you learn more about in this book, which is officially a memoir, I believe. But for this one, it's apparently we shouldn't think of it as autofiction. But because it came out in 1985, it was also not, it wasn't during the big boom of autofiction that we're having now. So I also believe that the author probably did not write it in that mindset. She probably did write it with the mindset that this is a novel. But there are other stylistic things that I think they're very similar to more contemporary autofiction. For the stylistic things that I'm not as much a fan of is the fact that it's short. Okay, that can go either way, but in general, I don't usually like short books. I'm trying to have an open mind. I like some of her other books that are short. There are no long paragraphs. The single sentences often get their own paragraph breaks. And there are it's divided into chapters, but then there are a lot of like breaks within those chapters. So I will have to put again the Joyce Carol Oates tweet about autofiction. Like you can see, there are different breaks in the writing, and that is totally a stylistic thing, but it's just simple writing. And I noticed that seems to me to be a trend in autofiction, and that might be why I don't like autofiction very much. So is it just the genre's problem? It's not this author's problem because I like some of her other stuff. It's just when she writes in this format that I find it underwhelming. So the idea of the book is the main character, Jeanette, is growing up in the UK in the 60s and 70s near Manchester. She was adopted, and her parents are evangelical Christians. So her father is sort of checked out of everything that's going on in his family, but the mother, the father's wife, is a total tyrant, basically. She is definitely fits the description for abusive. She is so controlling of Jeanette and just so oppressive in her evangelical beliefs. And Jeanette is also a lesbian. So she grows up and kind of realizes this and knows that that can't agree with the church's teachings. And it's really about this kind of her struggle in growing up and eventually escaping the church and escaping her mother. But the reason I didn't find it so compelling or interesting is because her mother is so hateful and so awful. She basically has zero redeeming qualities whatsoever. And you also see her interacting with other people, and they all basically hate her too. She's just such a hateful, judgmental, angry, sad person. And it's clear that anyone who doesn't have to deal with her avoids her. And her poor daughter just can't because she's a child and she's just at the mercy of this terrorizing mother that has adopted her. There are many references to the fruit oranges, but I found it pretty heavy-handed. It's like every 10 pages she's mentioning oranges, and there are no other like motifs or it's just told so simply that the orange metaphor or references and motif just seems so ham-fisted in that it loses any potency. Like, I think she should have restrained herself from constantly talking about oranges as seemingly the only literary device, and instead pared it down to a few instances where referencing oranges would be like more meaningful, so it would be more clear what they're a symbol of. I mean, I think it's just hope of a better future and perhaps being brave to reach, to overcome your horrible circumstances. But I didn't, she was trying to do something, but I feel like it kind of flopped. The other thing is later in the book, the author starts switching between the story that's been running throughout the whole book and then this kind of fairy tale fable. And I also didn't love that. Um, the fable kind of concludes, and I'm not sure what the point of it was. There is part of it where the protagonist in the fable, this person who kind of transforms into her father that then she has to run away from. Again, heavy-handed. Um, Secretly ties a string around a button on her clothes, and the idea is she always feels the pull of that string. So it's kind of like you can't ever fully escape from home, right? It leaves its imprint on you. So I found that again to be kind of like a basic idea. Um, and it's like the fable doesn't bring anything that we're not already really obviously getting from the plot of the book. So personally, I would not recommend this book. I am definitely not keeping it because I am not ever going to reread it. If you like autofiction and memoirs, I would recommend this one more, even though didn't love it either. So this one is called Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal. It was originally published, I believe, in 2011. It is 230 pages, so it's another shorter book, and it has a lot of the stylistic elements of this book. It describes a lot of the events that take place in Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. And actually, reading this book is what makes me more confident in calling this autofiction and not just a novel. Because by reading this one, we see how much of the material in Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit actually came from her real life. As long as we're believing this as a memoir and she's not doing something meta where it's like all a construct and this is actually a novel. But I don't think she's doing that. But it's possible. But this one kind of retells a lot of what you got from the first book. As I'm saying that out loud, I don't love it, but that's why I think you could just read this one if you want a memoir. For the sense of place, she describes the market everyone would do their shopping at, and she compares it to the more modern supermarkets of today, and about how there's no socializing. It's much more sterile and clinical, and the prices are all set, so there's no haggling. You're not running into people in the neighborhood regularly and like chatting with everyone, and just they're not a place to hang out. Where she described how the markets before, with the different sellers at their stands, all that social interaction took place. So I liked that. It's not as bleak as Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. Yet she describes some of the abuse she endured, and it's similar to what was written in Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, but it is worse in some cases. So it's upsetting and shocking, but it seems like somehow a more balanced work, because she talks about more of the good things about her community, and she kind of mentions how people were just going to church and relying on religion to give some meaning in their life, about how even just reading the Bible helped make people more literate and just more educated and thoughtful. And I'm by no means trying to defend the evangelical church that I don't really know anything about, and it sounds totally horrible, and she endured horrible abuse under the guise of, this is what the church wants. But it just seemed more nuanced in the community members she was surrounded by. Her mom is still basically terrible. And interestingly, she is always she almost always refers to her mother as Mrs. Winterson in this book. There's a couple places where she does call her mom, because I was like, is she ever going to use the word mom or mother? But she does at some points. But I thought that was interesting that in the memoir, closer to real life, she is like distancing herself from this woman by constantly calling her Mrs. Winterson. And she's still just like a really evil figure, which is sad. But I felt like it was a more, I don't want to say well-rounded, because if something terrible is happening, I don't want it to be that you can't write about it unless you throw in something good. But it just seemed like a more accurate and thoughtful reflection on life. Okay, a couple little pet peeves or nitpicky things that help me form my opinion. There is one chapter that opens with some law documents that she has received because she is trying to investigate her adoption and her own history and eventually possibly track down her biological family. And so she gives us the text of these obviously extremely cold legal language documents. And of course, it's a very emotional time and subject that she's trying to find where she came from in sort of a literal sense. And I think just having that text already accomplishes that. We all know, we've all been on this ride with her, that she had this terrible upbringing. After she was adopted, she has basically no memory of her biological family. Now she's trying to track them down. She's already told us about the difficulties and the frustrations. And then we start this chapter and it's like, boom, legal document words that kind of say nothing. And it's like we're frustrated from reading that ourselves. But then she has to write a couple paragraphs about how it's frustrating. And she says what we should make this process simpler and less insensitive. And I feel like it's obvious already, and she doesn't have to spell it out for us. And that is my problem with autofiction. It is something about this genre that when people write about their own life, they think everything needs to be spelled out for their readers. We didn't need her to write a few paragraphs that this was frustrating. We know. It's like show, don't tell when they're teaching you how to write when you're like 8 years old. You don't have to tell us how to feel. And now that I'm saying this, I don't know if the author feels like with their life they need to justify things more, or what is it? What is it about this genre that drives people to write poorly, even though I know they're capable of writing better things? I don't know. And then the other thing is right on the next page, she is talking about this budding relationship and about how she doesn't know if she's going to put the moves on this woman. And she talks about how she was consulting her friend for advice. And she has to mention that her friend is the writer Ali Smith, who I have never read, but I have seen her work on bookshelves at the bookstore. And I just feel like it's name dropping. That was something that really bothered me when I was reading Joan Didion as well, who I know is so beloved by a certain group that, again, I just couldn't get into it. And again, she wrote biographical things. Maybe I'm just bitter that I'm not one of these like cool artsy authors that's making my living by being an author. But they don't have to tell us, and they don't need to like name drop their author friends. It's like, you are cool. You don't need to add that. I know that's a little bit of a rant, but I just had to mention that. Next is The Passion. So this was the first of her work that I read, and I talked about it in one of my past videos, but I knew I needed to include it in this one as well. It is short. It's 160 pages, and it's split into 4 sections that are they could be kind of short stories that stand on their own. They do have recurring characters, and I like it as a complete kind of book altogether. So I'm not against all short books. This is one that I think is done super well. To me, it's like a little snow globe in that she creates this magical world that you feel like you're just getting a peek into. And the characters are morally ambiguous in a good way. Like they're realistic in that sense, that they have different desires and dreams and strengths and weaknesses. And I just kind of wanted to make that explicit because in The other two books that I just talked about, I felt like some of the weakness was just how, like, her mother is just so hateful and abusive. And I know there are people like that, but it wasn't that interesting to read about. Whereas in this book, I thought it was nuanced. It captured conflicting emotions and morals and all that type of good stuff. So I know she is capable of it, obviously, as she is a skilled author who can write that. There are some elements that are kind of magical realism, I think they would be classified as. And again, that's why in this book she weaves in this fairy tale thing, and I hate it. I think it's kind of useless. But in this book, it gives that feeling, but it's done so well. Whereas these are like, reality is so brutal and terrible. This is more of an escape story where kind of fantastical, magical things are happening, but it still deals with the difficulties of life and beauty and tragedy. Totally recommend. Next book and last for today is Written on the Body. So I also recommend this one. I did not love it as much as The Passion, but it is still pretty good. So you are introduced to the main character. So we have first person narration. She, in the opening section, she describes a lot of the different relationships she's had, which they have been a lot with women who are married to men. Then she settles into this relationship with, again, a particular woman who is married to a man, and how it all starts, how passionate it is, and the different moral qualms that come with that. The character, in when she's kind of hitting a low point, tries to go to church to find some comfort, and it doesn't work. She basically thinks it's all totally fake and put on, and she has to just perform as if she's enjoying it and believing things, to just due to the social pressure of being in the church. But then she goes by herself and prays and feels that actually helps a little, which I thought was interesting because it reminds you of things we learned about her life. And similarly, the character, when she's really struggling, goes and sleeps for 20 hours at some point. And Jeanette Winterson told us she also sleeps a lot when she's like having mental health crises. This narrator also is clearly chaotic, passionate, intense, with her love affairs. And that also reminds me of how she describes herself. And I'm hesitant to say this because Jeanette Winterson is complaining about how people are always projecting the author's identity into the characters they write, and especially when they're a female author. But I just have to say the similarities are striking. At one point, she talks about DIY coffins and about how we don't make our own coffins. And it just reminded me of the book As I Lay Dying, because that's how that book opens, is someone is making a coffin for their mother who is dying. And so I kind of wondered if that was like a reference to that or not. So it is a short book again, but I'm having an open mind. I still like it. The sentence structure is still not very complicated. We get some longer paragraphs, but nothing nothing really that long, which is fine. And there are breaks, there's kind of chapters, and there are breaks in the writing a lot. So it still follows that style of writing. In some ways I found it to be a nice cross between the passion and why be happy when you could be normal and oranges are not the only fruit. Um, because it is written in a style that's not so harsh and so bleak, and there aren't there's not magical realism elements, but it's a little more fanciful, exploring the reason we do things, our desires, how we get carried away sometimes. That's kind of like the passion. But then it takes place in the UK. The main character doesn't have a lot of money. She's kind of struggling to survive. She's lonely in a lot of ways, which is kind of like the Oranges and Why Be Happy book. So I liked seeing the author's life maybe reflected in this book, but still taken to an imaginative place. This is a bit of a spoiler, so don't listen if you don't want to hear any spoilers. But about halfway through the book, you find out that the woman the main character is with, the woman who's married, Louise, has cancer, leukemia. And at first I was kind of thinking, oh no, it's a little bit like, is she punishing her characters? Because so Louise is married. But Louise does eventually, she tells her husband, but it's like, is this some sort of punishment against the characters? Um, but I don't find that it is. Like reading it to the end, I think it's told in a way where it kind of balances out the ecstasy of them being together, and it just adds an element of realism. I will say at the end, the husband is a total D bag, a total piece of work. And I do think that's a bit oversimplified, where it's almost like the author in the end made him super evil so that we don't have to feel bad about Louise leaving him. But it's still a sad ending. It's actually the main character doesn't track down Louise, so we don't know if Louise is still alive or not. And I liked that ambiguous ending. The title written on the body, it's at first said in the first half of the book, and it's about their physical passion for each other, Louise and the main character. Towards the end of the book, it says the phrase, "This is the body where your name is written, passing into the hands of strangers." And it's about how we have strangers prepare our dead body for our funeral. So they have this amazing passion and love for each other, but it's going to be cut short tragically by cancer, which is a disease of the body. And the book talks about how cancer is when the body is rebelling against itself. And there's little not excerpts, but little sections in the book that are actually descriptions of different body parts, like different bones or blood cells. So I think it's a unique exploration of our kind of how our physical body ties into everything. So if you have never read Jeanette Winterson, I would definitely recommend starting with this one. Very good. And because all of her books are short, the bright side of that is they're not going to be a huge time commitment. Then if you like The Passion, I would recommend Written on the Body. Or start with Written on the Body if you like more realistic books. But I would have thought that I would like a more realistic book, but I think The Passion is better. If you like memoirs and autofiction, this isn't bad, but you have to be wanting to read a short book that's kind of simple. I'm just going to say it like that. And if you just freaking love this book and want more, then I would recommend this. But I don't really recommend this. I am going to keep my eye out for more of her books, though. More of her works of fiction that are really works of fiction. Because I think she does such a masterful job in these books. And I will definitely keep them because I might want to reread them in the future.